The silence at the table was absolute, heavy, suffocating, and delicious. My Aunt Patrice, a woman who usually filled every quiet moment with criticism, was frozen, with her wine glass halfway to her lips, her trademark smirk faltering into confusion. But she wasn't the one I was looking at. My eyes were locked on Mark, my cousin, an active-duty Navy SEAL trained to remain calm under fire, who currently looked like he was going to be sick. He had gone completely pale, staring at me across the centerpiece as if I had morphed into a monster. His knuckles were white as he gripped his fork, frozen in a posture of pure, instinctual submission. I simply sliced through my steak, the knife making a polite scrape against the china, and took a slow, deliberate bite. It was almost funny how wrong Patrice had been. She had spent her entire life believing that power was something you could see, that it looked like bicep measurements, loud voices, and war stories told at high volume. She didn't understand that in the world I actually lived in, real power is terrifyingly quiet. It isn't the operator kicking down the door, it is the invisible hand that points them to the building. Real power is the person who signs the document that authorizes the airstrike. The person who decides whether the gun stays in the holster. She thought she was dominating the room, but she didn't realize she was sitting across from the only person at the table who knew the clearance codes to her son's operation. To understand the fear in Mark's eyes, you have to understand the 2 hours that led up to this moment. When I arrived for Thanksgiving, the house was already buzzing with the performative patriotism my family loved so much. Aunt Patrice was in her element, practically vibrating with pride as she paraded Mark around in his dress whites. She introduced him to neighbors as the hero, her voice pitching up with theatrical adoration. Then she got to me. She gestured in my direction with a limp hand, introducing me to a family. Friend and this is Lena, our little paper pusher in D.C. She's basically a secretary for the government. But, hey, federal benefits, right? I felt that familiar cold weight settle in my stomach, the internal tally adding yet another mark to the long column of disrespect. The breaking point came when she cornered me by the drinks cart before dinner. I was just trying to get a glass of water when she loomed over me, smelling of Merlot and condescension. You know, Lena, she said, her voice carrying clearly over the jazz. Music? It honestly frustrates me to see where our tax dollars go. She took a sip of wine, checking to ensure Mark was watching her defend his honor. We have heroes like Mark out there doing the real work, sweating and bleeding, while bureaucrats like you just shuffle files in air-conditioned offices. I tried to deflect, giving my standard line about the sensitive nature of my department, but she cut me off with a snort. Oh, save it, she sneered. That I can't talk about it routine is just a convenient excuse for being boring. Just admit it, you file receipts. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she genuinely believed I was nothing. She thought she could bully me because I didn't wear a uniform or carry a trident. Patrice thought she was teasing the black sheep. She had no idea she was mocking the shepherd who watched over the wolves. The dinner table had become a theater, and Aunt Patrice was the director, producer, and star of the show. She regaled the family with exaggerated cinematic tales of Mark's training, stories I knew for a fact she had, embellished given the way Mark was currently studying his mashed potatoes like they contained an escape map. She spoke of Hell Week and high-value targets with the breathless excitement of someone watching an action movie, completely oblivious to the quiet, grim reality of the man sitting next to her. Every time Mark tried to offer a modest correction, she bulldozed right over him, her voice rising an octave to ensure the neighbors could hear about her warrior son. Then, inevitably, the spotlight swung to me, but the lighting changed from heroic gold to a pitying, fluorescent gray. The narrative shifted from the warrior to the spinster bureaucrat. Patrice looked at me with a sad, tight smile, the kind you give to a child who just dropped their ice cream cone in the dirt. She painted my life as a tragedy of fluorescent lights and endless spreadsheets, a lonely existence defined by filing cabinets and government red tape. It must be so draining, dear, she sighed, topping off her wine glass. Staring at screens all day, dealing with all those forms? But at least you have good dental benefits. That's something to hold on to. I took a slow sip of water, letting the cold liquid ground me while my mind drifted. 3,000 miles away to the windowless concrete reality of the vault. Patrice thought I worked in a cubicle farm. In reality, I worked in a sensitive compartmented information facility or SCIF, deep within the heart of Joint Special Operations Command. I wasn't a secretary, and I certainly didn't file receipts. I was a Level 5 targeting authorization officer. In the lethal ecosystem of modern warfare, I wasn't the trigger puller, I was the safety latch, the guidance system, and the judge. My job wasn't about administration, it was about the kill chain. While Mark and his team were the kinetic instrument, the hammer, I was the one who decided where the nail actually was. My days were spent analyzing pattern of life data, tracking the minute, habitual movements of the world's most dangerous men. I watched them sleep, eat, and meet with their lieutenants through high altitude, thermal feeds that turned human beings into glowing white ghosts on a screen. I didn't just organize files, I possessed absolute veto authority over strike packages. If I didn't see positive identification, or PID, that satisfied the strict criteria of international law, the mission was a no-go, regardless of how badly the operators on the ground wanted to breach the door. I remembered a night 6 months ago, a memory that felt a lifetime away from this pumpkin pie and stuffing. I was sitting at my terminal at 0300 hours, surrounded by the low, anxious hum of server banks and the smell of stale coffee. We were tracking a high-value target in a dense urban sector, a man responsible for 3 embassy bombings. The drone feed showed him entering a compound, but my analysis of the thermal signatures flagged a discrepancy. There were too many heat signatures in the adjacent room, small, erratic heat, signatures that matched the pattern of life for children, not combatants. A 3-star general was standing directly behind my chair, his breath heavy with frustration and peppermint. He saw the target, he saw the window of opportunity closing. "Authorize the strike, Lieutenant," he had barked, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We have the window. Drop the package." The room had gone deadly silent. Every analyst, every comms officer froze, waiting for me to buckle. In that moment, I wasn't a niece or a daughter or a paper pusher. I was the firewall between a successful mission and a war crime. "Negative, sir," I had said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "Collateral estimate exceeds the threshold. I am reading 4 civ packs in the blast radius. I am declaring a tactical abort under rules of engagement. Subsection 4. The general had slammed his hand on my console, screaming that I was letting a monster walk away. But I didn't blink. I refused to sign the authorization. The strike was scrubbed. 2 hours later, ground assets confirmed that the civ packs were indeed the target's grandchildren. I hadn't just done paperwork that night. I had saved the souls of every man in that unit, including the general's career, by refusing to let them become murderers. Snap back to the dinner table. Patrice was looking at me again, shaking her head with that insufferable performative sympathy. "I bet your wrist hurts from all that typing, doesn't it?" she asked, chuckling at her own wit. "Carpal tunnel is the silent killer of the administrative class." I smiled politely, slicing a piece of turkey with surgical precision. I looked at my wrist, the same wrist that had held firm against the screaming of a 3-star general. The same hand whose signature was the difference between a predator drone loitering or striking. I had spent 10 years protecting men like Mark from bad intel and legal nightmares, but tonight, the only thing I needed to protect was my patience. Dinner hit the table, a sprawling feast of roasted turkey and glazed sides that looked perfect but tasted like ash in my mouth. Aunt Patrice had moved on to her 3rd glass of Merlot, and the alcohol had dissolved whatever thin filter of social grace she usually maintained. She wasn't satisfied with just praising Mark anymore. She needed to elevate him by standing on my neck. She leaned over the table, her eyes glittering with a malicious sort of delight that made my stomach turn. "Mark," she slurred slightly, gesturing with her fork, "tell Lena about that time you had to sleep in the mud for 3 days, in... where was it? The jungle? Maybe then she'll appreciate her air-conditioned office and ergonomic chair a little more." Mark shifted in his seat, looking pained. He was a warrior, yes, but he wasn't a bully, and watching his mother dismantle me was clearly ruining his appetite. "Mom, don't," he muttered, keeping his eyes fixed on his plate, as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Lena's job is important too. It's government work. It matters. He was trying to be kind, trying to throw a bone to the poor, boring cousin, but his defense was weak because he didn't actually know what I did. To him, I was just a civilian with a security badge, someone who pushed paper while he pushed limits. He offered me a pitying smile, the kind you give a child who tried their best but failed. Patrice pounced on his hesitation like a shark smelling blood in the water. Important? She scoffed, laughing loud enough to startle the rest of the table. She files receipts, Mark. She organizes the office Christmas party. Come on, Lena, admit it. She pointed a manicured finger at me, accusingly. Your support staff. You're the background noise that real people ignore. Background noise? The words hung in the air, vibrating with a decade of missed birthday calls, forgotten achievements, and the constant, grinding assumption that I was secondary. I looked at her, and I saw every time she'd interrupted me, every time she'd looked past me to see if someone more interesting was walking into the room. I slowly put down my fork, the metal clicking against the china with finality. I realized in that second that arguing with her was useless because she didn't speak the language of emotion. She only spoke the language of hierarchy. If I tried to explain my worth, she would just laugh. But Mark spoke a different language. He spoke the language of clearance levels, call signs, and absolute authority. I looked at my cousin, completely unaware that he was sitting across from his boss's boss, and I felt a cold, calm focus wash over me. I decided right then to stop playing the niece and start playing the officer. I wasn't going to argue. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for, the truth, distilled into the one specific frequency only a seal would hear. She wanted to know where I fit in the food chain. So I decided to show her that I wasn't part of the meal. I was the one holding the menu. Patrice leaned in closer, her elbows resting on the table in a breach of the etiquette she usually prized so highly. She was looking for the kill shot, the final admission that my life was small, meaningless, and entirely beneath the glorious shadow cast by her son. Come on, Lena, she purred, her voice dripping with faux intimacy. We're all family here. You can be honest. All you do is paperwork, right? You shuffle forms from one pile to another until 5 o'clock hits. Just admit it so we can move on. I felt the eyes of the entire table on me, waiting for the invisible child to shrink back into the corner where she belonged. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. I don't file paperwork, Aunt Patrice, I said, my voice steady and devoid of the defensive tone she was desperate to hear. I oversee special missions. My primary function is ensuring strict compliance with international law and mission parameters during live operations. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. I spoke with the same flat, clinical affect I used when briefing the Joint Chiefs. Patrice threw her head back and laughed, a harsh, barking sound that grated against the crystal glasses. Oh, listen to her, she crowed, wiping a tear of mirth from her eye. Mission parameters. God, you watch too many movies. What, do you think you're in the CIA or something? What's your fancy code name then? Agent Paperclip? Special Agent Stapler? She looked around the table, beaming, expecting a chorus of laughter to validate her cruelty. But nobody laughed. I didn't look at her. I shifted my gaze directly to Mark. He was currently cutting a piece of ham, his face set in a polite, frozen smile, trying to weather his mother's storm. I caught his eye, locking on to him with an intensity that made him pause mid-cut. I needed him to understand that the conversation was no longer about family. It was about the chain of command. I don't have a code name, Mark, I said softly, but clearly, but within the network, my routing signature is Ghost 90. The effect was instantaneous and violent. It was as if I had reached across the table and slapped him. Mark froze. The fork slipped from his fingers and clattered loudly against his porcelain plate, a sharp, jarring noise that echoed in the sudden silence. The color didn't just fade from his face, it drained away entirely, leaving him looking ashen and sick. To a civilian, Ghost 90 sounds like gibberish, a random collection of cool-sounding words. But to a SEAL? To an operator in the field? Ghost 90 isn't a person. It is the ominous, disembodied voice from the tower that has the power to cancel their air, support, deny their extraction, or authorize the Hellfire missile that saves their lives. It is the voice of God on the comms channel. Patrice, oblivious to the fact that the atmosphere had just been sucked out of the room, looked confused. She glanced between me and her terrified son, her brow furrowing. "What?" she asked, her voice shrill with irritation. "Ghost 90? That sounds stupid. Is that supposed to be scary?" Mark swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked at me, and for the first time in our lives, I didn't see a cousin or a playmate. I saw a subordinate looking at a superior officer. "Mom, stop," he whispered, his voice trembling in a way that terrified Patrice more than any scream could have. He turned to her, his eyes wide and pleading. "You don't understand. Ghost 90 isn't an agent, Mom. It's an authority designator." He took a shaky breath, glancing back at me as if asking for permission to speak. "If she's Ghost 90, that means she's the one who authorizes my team's paychecks. She authorizes our gear, and she controls the extraction birds. Mom, she outranks my commander. She outranks everyone." The table went dead quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that usually follows a car crash. Patrice looked from her son, the hero she had placed on a pedestal, to me, the secretary she had spent decades belittling. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She was trying to reassemble her worldview, trying to make the math work, but the equation had fundamentally broken. The hierarchy she worshipped had just inverted in front of her salad plate. My aunt looked at her son for help, but for the first time in his life, Mark wasn't looking at her. He was waiting for me to dismiss him. I carefully folded my linen napkin, placing it next to my half-eaten steak with a deliberate, gentle precision. The sound of the cloth settling against the table was soft, barely a whisper, yet in the suffocating vacuum that had descended upon the dining room, it sounded like a gavel striking a judge's bench. I looked around the table one last time, taking in the scene not as a family gathering, but as an assessment of neutralized threats. Aunt Patrice was still staring at me, her mouth slightly open, her eyes darting between me and her son, as if trying to find the glitch in the reality she had constructed. She wanted to speak. I could see the muscles in her throat working, trying to find some insult, some dismissal that would put me back in my box, but the words died before they reached her lips. She couldn't mock me anymore because the source of her pride, her golden child, had just bowed his head to me. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the hardwood, and stood up. I didn't rush. I didn't look angry. I checked my watch, a simple tactical piece that Patrice had once called ugly and masculine, and tapped the face. "I have a briefing at 0800, I said, my voice cutting through the silence without raising a decibel. "And given the current threat levels in the sector, I need to be sharp." "Thank you for dinner, Aunt Patrice. The turkey was excellent." I turned my gaze to Mark. He was still sitting rigid, his hands in his lap, stripped of all the bravado his mother had draped over him like a costume. "Mark," I said, catching his eye. "Good seeing you. Stay safe on your next rotation. Check your comms protocols before you ship out." It was a test, a final confirmation of the new hierarchy, and he passed it instinctively. He didn't wave. He didn't say, "See ya, cuz." He straightened his spine, his years of conditioning overriding his confusion, and nodded sharply. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, the honorific slipping out automatically. "Thank you. I will." I walked out of the dining room, my heels clicking rhythmically on the floorboards, feeling the heavy gaze of my family burning into my back. But for the first time in my life, that gaze didn't feel like judgment. It felt like awe. I stepped out the front door into the cool, crisp night air, taking a deep lungful of oxygen that tasted sweet and clean. Behind me, the house was silent. There was no laughter, no clinking of glasses, no loud stories about how amazing Mark was. I had silenced the noise not by shouting, but by simply revealing the architecture of their own world. I didn't slam the car door when I got in. I closed it gently, sealing myself into the quiet, controlled environment that I preferred. As I drove away, watching the house shrink in my rearview mirror, I didn't feel the need to cry or scream. The ledger was balanced. I saw the years of "You're just a secretary" and Mark as the hero fade into the rear view, replaced by the image of a Navy SEAL terrified to pick up his fork because I was watching. 3 months later, the world had returned to its axis, but the tilt was different. I was back in the vault, the windowless, hyper-secure skiff, where the air is always recycled and the lights are always humming. The silence here was different than the silence at the dinner table. It was the silence of focus, of lethal competence. I was reviewing a logistical request for a specialized extraction team in the Horn of Africa, a high-risk maneuvering of assets that required Level 5 authorization. My terminal pinged with a secure message. I glanced at the sender ID and paused. It wasn't from a general or an analyst. It was from a field terminal. Sender, CPO Miller M. I opened the message. It wasn't a family email. There were no questions about how I was doing or apologies for his mother's behavior. It was professional, terse, and respectful. Requesting expedited review on the attached gear wreck. Commander said, "You're the approving authority. Thanks for the cover on the last op. We got out clean because of the timing update." I leaned back in my chair, the ergonomic mesh supporting me as I stared at the screen. He was asking for a favor, but he was asking through the proper channels. He was acknowledging that his safety, his gear, and his success depended on my signature. I didn't need him to say, "Sorry, my mom is a narcissist." The fact that he was emailing me for permission was the only apology that mattered. It was an admission that while he might carry the rifle, I held the map. I typed out a quick approval, authorized the gear transfer, and hit send. A faint smile touched my lips as I watched the sent confirmation flash green. I thought about the nature of glory then. Mark would always get the medals. He would get the parades, the free beers at the bar, and the adoration of people like Aunt Patrice, who needed their heroes to be loud and visible. And I was fine with that. I didn't need the applause. I realized then that I never wanted their love. I had wanted to be seen. And now, every time Mark looked up at the sky waiting for a drone, or every time Patrice bragged about her son's safety, they would have to think of me. They didn't have to like me. They didn't even have to understand me. But they had to respect me. I had accepted that my legacy wouldn't be carved on a statue in the town square. It would be written in the classified logs of missions that succeeded because I said yes and catastrophes that were averted because I said no. I turned back to my monitors, the glow of the thermal feeds illuminating my face, and went back to work. Some people need applause to feel important. I just need to know that when I speak, the people who matter listen. If you're the quiet professional holding your family together or keeping the world turning while others take the credit, tell me your story in the comments. The ghosts see you.